Everybody to another Game Design of the Month podcast here on Game Wisdom. I am, of course, Josh Bycer, and joining me, as always, from Epic Tavern, game designer Tomo Moriwaki. How are you doing?
Hello. How's everyone going?
I am doing great, as apparently, the weather and noise are, conspiring against me with, glares and dogs and all that popping up right now. But it's great to chat with you again. We are going to be discussing horror for this month's design cast, which I guess is very topical as it's going to be Halloween in about, 3 days from right now. So, I guess to start with, for you, Tomo, do you play horror games? What is your thoughts on getting scared in video games?
It's interesting, for a long time, I'd play the odd game just to keep up with respect to games that had scary themes. And some of those, and I think Silent Hill is probably an important outlier, were legitimately scary because they were able to kind of create that atmosphere and vibe. But in a lot of cases, it was just sort of a scary skin
Mm-hmm.
wrapped around sort of, third-person action adventure, first-person action adventure, isometric gameplay of some sort. And so it's an interesting thing to talk about because I think at its core, it's um, what's the difference between a game genre and a game theme? And in
Mm-hmm.
the context of horror, horror sort of transcends genre, at least at its core, right? Because it's not a series of mechanics, it's not a certain type of
Mm-hmm.
game, it's a certain kind of feeling. And I mean, I think that's real topical in terms of where the evolution of the game industry and the products that are being made as we go forward are all about.
Yep. It's what I spent my fourth book on, Game Design Deep Dive Horror. So for those of you watching, be sure buy that book. There'll be links to it in the description and all that. But yeah, you are correct that horror is not defined by its mechanics, and we can certainly see that with the indie space when it came to horror over the past 10 years. There have been cooking sim horror, driving sim, dating, miniature golf. I saw there was a horror game about that. I mean, there is a lot. You can pretty much derive horror from just about every possible mechanical genre.
Well, you
Oh,
can derive horror theme,
yeah,
right? But you may not be able to create horror.
yep, and that's a good distinction there because there is a difference between having the theme of horror versus actually being a scary game. And that is something that I think has been a major challenge for a lot of indie developers. And we could even argue a lot of AAA developers as well. You can see, if we're talking about kind of like that push and pull, I think Doom would be certainly a good example. Doom is a game that is horror themed. I mentioned this in my book. You are on Mars fighting demons from hell. That should be scary. But no, it's not. It is rip and tear until it is done time.
Totally.
And I guess here's a question for you. Did you play Doom 3? And if you did, what did you think of that one?
I did, but I just ran through it the same way I did Doom 2. It was still so, like, I think something worth noting is that the audiences for games back then, they themselves weren't ready for actual horror. They were still like very much like fixated on mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
And I might have even said that it's a horror game, but I wouldn't have known what I was talking about. I played a first person shooter that's essential themes are actually more like burping while picking up shotgun shells and saying "oh yeah," rather than any feelings of fear or any kind of psychological horror or thriller like aspects to the experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's I think always been that challenge of it's not just about putting spooky things in. It's about, pulling those right psychological levers. And that takes, I think, a level of skill that a lot of developers don't necessarily. I don't think it's a case of them not having it, but I think it's them kind of missing the mark. Like, Dead Space, I think, is a good example. Dead Space is a really good horror game, but it also, I think, leans too much in some aspects of the action side of things. Like at some point in a Dead Space game, you're going to have a fully upgraded railgun, you're going to have your stasis ready, and it's like, oh, big scary monster, freeze, railgun, nail him to the back of the wall, and he's gone.
Well, and I think it's just in a very, very interesting time in the game industry, where sort of like we were learning what it means to actually threaten a player. If I die and respawn and there's no consequences of dying, then it's impossible to create that feeling. And we weren't in the business of creating feelings other than the feeling of exhilaration and power.
The power fantasy, yep.
Huge fan of that still. That stuff is awesome,
Mm-hmm.
and it has its place. But if you wanted to make, like, I'm sure it's like Silent Hill 1, and that you can't control this, and creepy, terrible things are happening, and we're gonna deliver a punchline that's just sad and awful. That wasn't something that anyone was concerning themselves about. They were more focused on getting the gameplay right, and we didn't have any other continuum other than the adrenaline continuum. It's like we've had conversations before where we talk about, like, you go to like 1998 and it's like games are adrenaline 100% of the time. At least the action games, like the real-time 3D games, the era that PlayStation 1 kind of inaugurated was one of fast-paced, and I pick up the controller and I am 100% engaged and I'm focused. And then when I'm done, all my levels go back to normal and I do the real life shit. And then the industry started to mature. And next thing you know, it's like some of the adventure games that had a great moment in our past, they start creeping back in. And story-rich experiences start to creep in. And many of the hardcore gamers complaining to high heaven. It's like, story has no place in a game. And I'm embarrassed to say that I had said that a few times in that period of time.
Yeah, and like Silent Hill is a really good example, and why it's still, I think, held up as one of the gold standards of horror is that, like you said, it's not a game about you feeling powerful. It is a game about you running around a decrepit town wondering what the hell is going to jump out at me behind the next corner. And, like, trying to fight that power fantasy, I think, is one of the major points about good horror design. I guess, here's the other, like, hot topic question for you. What are your thoughts on horror games where you have no means to defend yourself? So, the killer comes at you, you're dead, basically.
I mean, I love those games because they're courageous and they're exploring a new experience. It's like, it's not, if we play a lot of games and you know what that's like, you've had a lot of the power fantasy. And when that's done well, I mean, I'm never going to put that down forever. I'm always going to be coming back to that, like more boom, celebrating my skill and my effectiveness, my rapid ability to judge a situation and be effective and overcome obstacles, and more often than not, put that bad guy down with like massive prejudice and joyful prejudice if need be, which is like almost 180 degrees from this game is trying to convince me to run, and it's going to make me panic a little bit and scream like a little girl right in the last few seconds.
I think for me, I'm with Mojo and chat. Like, my problem is if you remove all conflict in a horror game, it just feels very much like a haunted house to me. And I think this could very well be the fact that I've played so many games that, it's kind of like if you send like a special effects artist to like go to a haunted house. They're like, yeah, I know, creepy hallway here, there's a little spot in the wood here, the guy to pop out, there's nothing scary. And the problem for me is that I've reached that point where if there is no conflict, there's no, I think, stakes for me. And I think, like, there has to be, I think it goes back to what you said a few minutes ago about the idea that, loss or failure need to have weight to it. in order for there to be tension. And we do need to, I think, as a future topic, talk about games that have like punishment systems, like Dark Souls, roguelikes, and etc. But when it comes to horror, I think developers go one of two extremes. You have kind of the Amnesia style, where death is basically, if I'm right here, I die, I go here. Death means nothing. Or it's, you die, there goes the last 20 minutes, you need to repeat the whole area, do all the puzzles again, etc., etc. Something like a Nun Massacre from Puppet Combo would be an example here. And I feel like those two extremes kind of hurt horror, because if there is no punishment, then there's no feeling to be scared. If you get too much punishment, then it's less about being scared, more about, oh god, the thing just killed me. Well, there goes 30 minutes of play again. Gotta restart.
Yeah, it's like the feeling of horror is trapped right between power and agency and
Yep.
frustration.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's only if you use conventional mechanics, though, right?
Yep.
And so as the storytelling capability of indie developers grows, the the capacity to create these horror-like experiences. And that's not to say that's the best horror game, right? The games can be any measure of scary slash horror, and potentially be successful, especially if their mechanics are excellent. Like the idea of Left 4 Dead comes to mind, where especially for the first 10 or 12 times you play, you don't feel powerful, but
Mm-hmm.
you can get there. And in those playthroughs where you really had to struggle, and when the witch that screams shows up, you wanna pee your pants a bit. That's a great moment of horror. And then eventually you get, if you have a steady group of three buddies, you're like, we delete all resistance. This is no longer challenging, and now it's just an expression of skill, and it's back to being a power fantasy. And that's really the only pitfall of having kind of conventional action mechanics in that horror setting, right? And that's the right call for that point in history, because now at some point down the line, some of those story-rich game developers are gonna get better and better at kind of establishing something creepy. I'm reminded of a game that I learned about in your channels called The Cat Lady, I think, and it's not scary, but it is horror, right? That there's a non high pressure, non adrenaline based sort of feeling of dread and an awful heaviness to it. Even though the graphics are brutally low fidelity, it's a little bit awkward to play, and yet it still delivers that feeling.
Yeah, there's that sense of malice that I think runs through that experience that works really well. And for anyone watching this live record, if you like, very depressing, disturbing stories, definitely play The Cat Lady, but do not play that with kids around. That is a very dark story. And
unless you want to talk about suicide with your kids.
Oh yes, there's a very happy topic we can for our chat. And like what you said about kind of like the first time you play, I think that's another very unique aspect that horror has that no other genre, is that it's very much a one play kind of game. That you really can only experience horror design one time. And this is something that I talked about in my book, about the idea of implementing more roguelike or procedural generation to horror design. That for a lot of the best horror games, it is very much just one and done. Like, you can't get that same feeling of terror playing Resident Evil after 30 different plays. I'm sure every speedrunner of Resident Evil doesn't get scared anymore playing that game. And it's the same...
Oh, the chainsaw guy killed me again.
Mm-hmm. Like, when I played Resident Evil 2 Remake, I thought that was one of the more solid action horror games of the last, 5 years. But once I started going for my S Plus run of it, there's no room for it being scared. It's basically, okay, zombie coming through here, go around here, make sure I have enough ammo, don't get that. Oh no, there's Mr. X, let me just run down here, he's gone, and move right along.
And for a game like that, if it can create like sort of the gameplay mechanical structure that is good for replayability, then its thematic structure sort of needs to go down a sort of a camp joke. Like it needs to capture some of like Monty Python and Rocky Horror Picture Show. And then it can be horror themed, right? But you're not scared, but you still laugh or you still smile and giggle at the same places, the same way you might feel when you rewatch those movies. Although I must say, I haven't seen a game that actually has done this. I haven't experienced this in a game, but this idea of something being legitimately quite scary and then replaying it and being able to capture much of that scariness. But I have felt that in the context of the Western remake of The Ring.
Mm.
I found that was such a fantastically kind of constructed idea that upon rewatching, I could still get a pretty strong hit of sort of fear like emotional response while I dig deeper into the darkness of the story. But that's because it's a more sophisticated and sort of rich kind of under the surface elements to the story, especially like in the kind of the rapid replaying of some of those video scenes where a nail gets ripped off and there's a fly and there's a horse's head or whatever, but all that stuff comes together and kind of accommodates replay. Now that's fairly sophisticated, and I don't think we've necessarily seen that executed to that level of effectiveness yet necessarily.
So here's a question for the chat watching this live recorded. Can you think of a horror game that did manage to keep that sense of horror on multiple playthroughs? Because this was something that I spoke about in my book, that I couldn't think of one. And like the problem I think horror has is that it's the one genre that's I think very counterintuitive to where game development and game structure went over the last 10 years, which is, of course, live service, games as a service. We're trying to get someone to keep playing these games. The problem with horror is that you can't have a 50 to 100 hour horror experience. Horror cannot be maintained for that period of time because eventually you're going to start seeing all the wires and the strings. Even in a story-driven game, okay, this window, there's going to be a lightning strike, and then there's going to be a face over here. There's going to be a guy that comes behind me at this point. And this, I think, led... Hey, Dragon. And I think this led to that interview with the Resident Evil Revelations developer. I think this was back in 2012, 2013, saying that survival horror was no longer marketable. And that was, of course, the era when Call of Duty and Battlefield really began to blow up. This was, the rise of multiplayer as kind of the forefront for a lot of games.
Well, and I think we can also say that something that just throws a wrench in this story is just the ascendancy of the zombies, right? They sort of like got in the way of the camera when it came to horror, right? And they got in everything. And that's not to say there aren't a bunch of zombie related entertainment products that are interesting, but it sort of, we took a break from sort of, I'd say, conventional or legitimate horror in some ways and replaced it with action horror. And everybody was okay with that, so there's nothing wrong with that break, but it's not the same, right? It's not the same to try to min-max length of survival than it is to literally try to survive and feel some fear and the risk of loss and not have the power to simply eliminate the threat.
Yeah. And I've come up with several horror design ideas over the last years. I would love to make them at some point. Maybe the developer wants to work on me. But the big thing I feel is that, like you said, with the rise of the zombie, the trash mob or the grunt, that really eliminates a lot of horror. One enemy is terrifying. Fighting 75 of them over the course of a single playthrough, not so much. And I think this is again where Dead Space kind of loses it. That you have this very, haunting background of, the Ikamura and then, the space stations. But, I walk into a giant room, all the doors shut around me. There's no room to be scared there. It's, okay, pull out the gun, kill 4 or 5 waves of enemies, doors open, we move on.
The first thought is bring it.
Exactly. And like I've said this before, like jokingly about Dead Space, I got to the point where I was more concerned about trying to come up with witty one-liners after I kill an enemy than
Nice.
being scared or tense. It's like, okay, yes, it's a zombie or it's a necromorph. Let me just grab this claw right here, stasis fling it at the guy, and he's dead.
Although I feel like there was some innovation and some forward progress, like in the context of the Friday the 13th game, right?
Mm,
By making it multiplayer and having it
yes.
be what amounts to like a kids game, sort of, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now the people who aren't the scary big bad, they will have moments of terror as they have to cope with the power differential. At least their objectives. Their objectives are not to kill Jason, right? Their objectives are to fulfill some set of things, which are made extra difficult because Jason's really hard to deal with.
Yeah.
And
And
many a stream I've seen where people are screaming like children. It's awesome.
yeah, and I'm really glad you brought up multiplayer in Friday the 13th because that's another major point that I talked about in the book. That there was a time when people thought horror and multiplayer could not coexist. And this was again during the rise of the action horror, the live service kind of gameplay. Everyone remembers, of course, Dead Space 3. And the problem with Dead Space was you were basically taking an overpowered character and you're doubling them. So it's not about you and a friend surviving. It's basically two turrets now going out and clearing waves of enemies. But with Friday the 13th, there's been I know like a few dozen indie multiplayer games that have done this. The whole idea that okay, you can be the monster, or you can be the survivors, and you have that huge power imbalance between the two. And I think that's where in the folds there, or however they say the cracks, there's potential for really good horror.
Yeah, no, and I think it actually happened, right? And there's
Mm-hmm.
so many different facets of horror too. Like just you talking there, I realized like you can make a game like Aliens, and you can make it scary, and that you have like a squad with like half a dozen people in it, or maybe even a dozen people, and now the whole game is about picking the right ways to sacrifice yourself to create time for your teammates and die
Mm-hmm.
in a glorious horror movie like fashion,
Yeah.
right? And there's this then to be fair, that wouldn't be scary so much as like sort of the drama of your slasher flick where now Jody dies.
Mm-hmm. Game over, man. Game over.
And then that could be sustainable though if there were only four of you playing, and then you just occupy one of the other characters after that. But that's a different take on it. Just the
Mm-hmm.
same way as like Dungeon and Dungeon Keeper, kind of you take the opposing side, right? And now you get to kind of imagine the horror maybe that your targets are going through.
Mm-hmm. And I think like again that power imbalance is a very important point that it's not just about making one side completely unstoppable. It's about giving everyone their own unique abilities. And again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about just removing all sense of conflict. That it's good to have, and the Dragon brought up a really good point. I was thinking about that as we were talking about multiplayer horror as well. But I'll get to that in a second. That if it is just four people, they can't do anything but run. It's just not really impactful. Like there has to be something there. There has to be, I guess, keeping with this horror, there has to be meat on the bone for you to go for, or I think it just loses itself.
Oh, easily. And I mean it's a really hard emotional state to
Mm-hmm.
elicit out of a player, right? And I can walk in, and if I'm just even kind of not into it, like I'm useless as a
Oh yeah.
as a target to be made scared, right?
Oh
Now,
yes.
super high fidelity, super well called. If we were to take just a fantastically scary movie, well, you pick the favorite thing in your own memory and somehow make it just interactive enough so that you sink your psyche into it a little bit more. And it's really how like a great horror movie tricks you into thinking the character's going to die. Music starts to swell, the timing starts to happen, and you're like, oh shoot, this
Mm-hmm.
is it. I thought this was a more important character. Well, that's it. Oh well. And then it barely doesn't happen. And then now you've been shaken, right? You've been
Mm-hmm.
destabilized. And then the next one that happens, well, the first one you telegraph. Like it's a real feint. I am going to go for a full-on punch to the face, and
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna flinch because it looks so real that I'm going to hit you. But then I don't at the last
Mm-hmm.
minute, and then now you're out of sorts, and then we surprise you without the telegraphing. You're like, Jesus Christ, why are you doing this to me?
Yeah.
And then of course, depending on the type of horror movie, then it's like another surprise and you're dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I just wonder like what audiences felt like when they saw Psycho for the first time, and I still haven't seen it, but I've watched enough people talk about that. The main female protagonist, she gets killed. Like the first half of the movie, you think she's gonna be the one. She's our main character. Nope. Go like that, and you have to, I think, keep people surprised. I love what you said about like make the first one telegraph the from what was that, Friday 13th, or was that Halloween? I always get the two confused there. But yeah, like you have to get it's like the person's walking, you see Michael Myers in the window or Jason, you go, okay, it's gonna happen. It's like, no. And then they walk in the room, then he just breaks down the door, and it is all about that sense of surprise. And what you said about if you're not in it, or you're not fully immersed, it just ruins it. Like people who've watched me play horror games know that I am. It's very hard to shake me, and that's just again because I played so many of them. That we were playing what was it, the Murder at the Laundromat game, the one that just came out a few weeks ago, and like it was just not working for me in terms of horror. Like I was like reading chat, talking to people, I was like, oh, there's a scare. Oh, I just heard a loud noise. Like it just I was completely resistant to it. And I think again, like it gets back to how hard it is to make a very well paced horror game.
Yeah. And I mean that lead up and that telegraphing is so essential. And so it's funny when it was done right. Like my daughters, when they were young, they just ran out of the room, and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
"What's going on?" And it's like, "Oh, the scary music's coming on."
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then they run around the corner and they just peer around and stare at the TV from afar.
Yep. Like one of my favorites was from the first Condemned, and there's a part on the penultimate level when you're in like this farmhouse, and you have to find these different clues. It's very non-linear. I thought more people need to, or that should have been studied more as a really good example of a horror level. But there's a part in there where you have to go kind of like under the house, into the basement. And when you're in there, the game will just keep spawning these kinds of very trash enemies at you. But they're always coming. So it's this sense of tension, like, okay, I need to do this, but at the same time, I gotta get the hell out of here. These are just gonna keep coming up and, hitting me in the back or just getting in my way. And I thought that was just a really great way of, keeping that sense of tension down there, because they're going to come, you just don't know where or when. And I think that's, again, that mystery aspect is where horror really resides.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because, earlier before the call started, I was talking about a game design presentation that I like to make. And it's all about surprise and predictability.
Mm-hmm.
And that you can't have surprise without predictability, right? In fact, if everything is unpredictable, it's all just chaos. And so I can't build an expectation that you then break.
Mm-hmm.
And the art of doing that is it's a hard thing to do. In a lot of cases in game development, we just avoid it. We just don't do it because it's just too hard to manage. It's like, yeah, I gotta put this energy towards increasing the fidelity of this experience, or I have to put
Mm-hmm.
it into the systems of motivation for progression, or I need to get these interactions to just feel good. And you don't get to establishing patterns so that people start get lulled into a sense of comfort and then shocking them.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you do have the bandwidth, that's very hard to do well. It takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of well, it takes a lot of motivation from the developer side, and then you still need a lot of practice to get it right. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it kind of chases away a lot of developers, except for those that are like really,
Mm-hmm.
you know, not just diehard fans of the idea of it, but also resilient enough to suffer some pretty serious defeats developing games.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I want to touch on before I forget it again, like another challenge of horror is definitely building the consumer base around it. Because just as, it's very hard for developers to come up with horror, there's a lot of people who don't want to get scared by a game. And, that is, perfectly acceptable. But it's that, again, it's that line I think you have to walk from a development standpoint of, if we make this not scary, well, the fans come for horror, they're not going to be into it. If we make it too scary, then we're only adhering or we're only catering to that niche horror, and the common developer or the common consumer is not going to get into it. And I think this has been kind of the subtle success of Resident Evil, that despite the ups and downs, it's probably the most mainstream horror franchise the game industry has.
I agree. Yeah, and and it's so funny because some of their success is due to having difficult to use control schemes.
Mm-hmm.
I remember Resident Evil 1, right? And I'm just like,
Mm.
at the worst part, I'm just going back and forth between two camera views in a corridor because forward goes down the corridor, but then the camera switches, then I go back.
Yeah.
But then after that frustration, I'm being followed by a zombie that's not walking very fast, right? But walk back into it because of that, and then I'm panicking.
Yeah.
So funny.
Oh yes.
Um, I just had an idea for an interesting game to wrap around this idea of horror. Is you create a roguelite game, and you're watching your characters in a hardcore like mode with legacy, which is important.
Mm-hmm.
That's like, imagine if you were there were they're like parapsychologists, right, going to haunted houses, and sometimes it's a hoax. Sometimes you're gonna milk it to create some interesting controversy and make more money, and then sometimes there's something scary, kind of like the Insidious series of movies. And except that if it's bad, usually the parapsychologist dies.
Yeah.
They just can't make it, right? And you just kind of see this going on, and you're kind of getting upgrades, and you're kind of getting access to new things. But anytime that parapsychologist survives, right, now they start to get famous. And
Mm-hmm.
the more famous psychologist unlocks access to the harsher, more effed up
Nice.
haunted houses.
Yeah. And that the concept of adding procedural and roguelike design is something that excuse me, that is kind of my dream horror idea as well. That you're exploring like this mansion, of course, it has to be a mansion, but the enemies and the threats and the major events are going to be randomly chosen from a pool each time you play. And like in my vision of it, like one enemy should be a credible threat. Like there's no trash mob. Like the trash mob of this game would be maybe like the mini boss of another title. So you don't know when you start playing, okay, what is going to happen this time? Am I going to get the event when, giant insects are going to infest this place? Am I going to get the event where, this headless monster is going to try and get me? And it's up to you to react on the fly as to, what is coming to get you. And I do think, like you were saying, that I think procedural design, like roguelike elements, is going to be like the next evolution or the next iteration of horror.
So, in the context of that presentation, what's interesting is you can create a stronger response, right? If the expectation has been established strongly. So now, in some ways, you need that procedural gameplay so that so and so and so and so and so and so can die. And you just
Mm-hmm.
watch it happen, and now you're getting used to it, right? The key is a pattern that lulls you into a sense of comfort. Oh well, yeah. Oh my, they had no chance.
Hmm.
The ghostly demon just enveloped them and sucked all the moisture out of their body, and they were dust. And then this one, the scary grandma isn't
Hmm.
actually dead and comes out of the closet and gouges out your eyes and sews them up. And at the end, you see some horrible image, and you start getting used to like, oh, this is kind of funny. I like this. And then boom, now it suddenly they don't die right away. And now
Hmm.
suddenly you're like, oh my God, are they going to make it? And
Hmm.
now you start threatening them that they will make it rather than threatening them that they won't make it, right? And now we
Hmm.
can start getting that feeling going. And then the
Yeah.
moment they survived one, now you're like, oh God, now I feel like their chances of survival every time is only 1 in 3. This is
Hmm.
horrifying. I know they're going to die, but I'm invested in them now.
Yeah.
And in that case, we probably cheated so they for sure survived the second one.
Hmm.
Now we got you on the hook. Now we'll
Yeah.
have that next encounter. It's gonna be interesting for the player.
Yeah, and I think that idea of establishing rules, but then establishing them to break them, is
Yeah.
a really good idea. We're right now there. I believe the Fatal Frame 4 is coming out or is being re-released on PC. I'm really interested in that one. And Fatal Frame 3 has like two of my favorite gotcha moments. And to explain them, I have to spoil them, but considering the game is over, I think like 15 years, I think the statute of limitations is out.
Hundred
But
percent.
like the first thing is that the game is built on the structure that you're being pulled into this nightmare world when you go to sleep. So during the daytime, it's supposed to be nice and happy, and nobody's going to come and get you. But as you start playing the game, suddenly you're going to see ghosts in the daytime sections, and of course, it's as soon as the camera cuts too. It's like I walk around the corner of my home. There's my laundry room. Oh, there's a ghost staring at me from behind the behind the washer. And it's just such a great moment of, yeah, you thought like they can't hurt you, but you're not expecting to see them in this section and just get you entirely. And then the other I love the story point. It's like it's the second to last level, and you're playing as the one of the side characters who thinks that, hey, I solved the whole mystery. All we have to do is gather all these MacGuffins. We go to her body, we stake her. It kills the curse. We're winning. So that whole level is you gathering all those items that you need, and then during that final cutscene, you see him like going in. He's like barely breathing because it's like heavy miasma. He gets to the body, and she's been completely staked like 10 to 15 times, and the guy just like, oh crap.
Oh.
And then of course you see her ghost like right behind them. And it's just such a great like subversion of like, oh, you thought you were going to save the day and do the whole, nope, she just kills you.
Yeah, it's so important to be thinking about that, right? It's if you're
Mm-hmm.
gonna make good horror, you gotta be good at the setup, and then you
Mm-hmm.
gotta be good at the switcheroo. It's like you play the whole game, you're collecting up the pieces of the gun that will auto kill ghosts, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
you get to use it. You get to kill dozens of ghosts or something, right? And
Mm-hmm.
now we're going to get to the main ghost, right? And the first thing you run into is just a big, strong guy who's
Mm-hmm.
being controlled by the ghost. And you're like, oh, I
This ain't
have
gonna work.
I haven't thought at all about how to deal with this.
Yeah. And what you said there about like the setup and the pacing, that's I think another thing that really like drives me crazy with a lot of indie horror, is that I think they mess up when it comes to that setup. That good horror isn't just we're going to play a random noise, or character turns around and there's a spooky face. Like there has to be more to it than that, and it is incredibly difficult to get it to that point.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, and what's interesting is like there is no set formula to pull that off, right? Is that I
Mm-hmm.
need to give you new information. I need to establish a pattern with new information so that you don't feel like you already know the punchline. That
Mm-hmm.
I build a new way of imagining what's going to happen next. And
Mm-hmm.
then at the same time, I need there to be valid results that you're not expecting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like when M. Night Shyamalan made Sixth Sense, he was crapping his pants the whole time that everyone would just figure it out. And he's like, then it's nothing. It's nothing if everyone figures it out. All this work, it just goes
Yep.
nowhere. And he lucked out, or he did a great job. I mean, Sixth Sense surprised a lot of people, right? Like, oh shit, you're right. Oh my god, right? And that oh shit, you're right moment. It's always it's as dynamic as trying to have a good date with someone.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And like when it comes to like jump scares, I mentioned this in the book that like one of the most famous jump scares was the dog jumping through the window in Resident Evil. And the reason why that's so poignant is that when he jumps through the window, you have to react to it. It's not just, a cutscene or the dog disappears. It's a legitimate threat that you weren't expecting. And
Yeah.
it's very hard to make that work, especially just keep giving jump scares. And we've seen a lot of indie horror that it's, walk into a room, oh no, scary noise. Walk in the next room, oh no, there's a, face in the mirror. And it's just like, by the third time, it's like, okay, where's the horror going to come from? Is it going to come from that conveniently placed cabinet that I have to open up?
Well, I have two non-horror examples.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a level in the middle of Medal of Honor in 2010 that I worked on, and in this level, you are a ranger, and you're fighting your way through the Afghani wadis and up a hillside, and you have some intense gunfight moments, and then you eventually find yourself at this like at the bottom of a large sort of mountainous area, and there's a hut, and there's a little shack, and when you go up to the shack, there's a cell phone noise, and someone yells IED, and it explodes, and you start the thing all shaky, and people start attacking from all sides. And what we were trying to do is manipulate the player into feeling certain that the game was going to bring this character's life to an end, and then we were just trying to dramatize your death. And we had to sell that super hard. All the characters are running out of ammo. We're running out of ammo. Call back the reinforcements. We're not going to make it. And at the same time, also in the context of first-person shooter gameplay, pressure the player to believe that we're about to turn it up one more notch and you can't survive. Mm-hmm. Almost to the point where, okay, this is about the time I should put the controller down. And then I'll get a cutscene. And only then instead to change the script very, very, very suddenly and have a bunch of Apache helicopters come and save the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. The amount of effort it takes to create that you need audience to test it on. You're like, oh, we gave it away if because you weren't taking enough damage from the beginning. Okay, so we're going to need to take more damage. And then we're giving you more damage, and we're like, oh, shoot, but now we're killing the player too much, and that's actually not that interesting. To die right before the game automatically saves you, right? And we're like, okay, so we're going to have to have some kind of mathematical cushion so that you don't actually die if you're really close to death. And just all this stuff suddenly isn't about the game mechanics. It's about it's about the theatrics of it, to try to tell you this is what's going to happen, and then instead give you a valid result that's different. The other example is actually super old school. If you ever played Ultima 3 Exodus, when you complete the game, you have to kind of escape while everything's getting destroyed, and it's literally hooked to how many steps you've taken away that the effects of the destruction of your environment are. And so if you're trying to get away as quickly as possible, it always feels like it's timed perfectly. And if you literally stop and just go back and forth over and over again, nothing happens. Yeah. But it's all tricks of the mind, ultimately.
Oh, yes.
Or Ultima 3.
As a quick time check, I know it's about 4:55 my time. Do you have to go in the next 5 to 10 minutes?
Yeah. Let's try to close this up in 10 minutes. So
okay.
That sounds good.
Yeah, and like horror and non-horror is another major point. Like we could spend a good 30 to 40 minutes on that one easily. And again, it's all about pulling those right levers in terms of how you set the mood and the pacing for the scene. Some big examples, Judge Doom from Who Framed Roger Rabbit, happy cartoony movie, and then Christopher Lloyd scares kids, or Large Marge from Pee-wee's Playhouse or Pee-wee's Grand Adventure. Like,
Awesome.
you can do horror and non-horror. A Hat in Time has a level that I know freaked out a lot of people, where you're in like this haunted house, and
The spider in Limbo.
yeah, it's all
Holy crap!
yep, it's all about how you frame and set up these scenes, and really good horror. I think in a lot of cases is just one-offs. Like you really can't repeat that same thing because it loses that impact once you know what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can, if you want to proceduralize the one-off, you need to understand the patterns of setup really well. I think that this idea of theatrics, a game that intends to make you feel horror or fear, um, has no option to not have expertise in theatrics of it. Whereas, an ARPG, you could be like, I can't do it, but
Mm-hmm.
I've done all the formulas. The loop progression kicks ass, and you're like, okay, this game can succeed still, right? Whereas if it's a horror game, and you're like, yeah, I can't get the theatrics right. It's like you can't do the horror game then. Just
Mm-hmm.
like if you can't do the progression right, you can't do the ARPG.
Yeah. And like I think doing like procedural like World of Horror is a really good example. And if you haven't played that one, definitely check that one out for people
You said
watching. Yeah,
World of
World
Horror.
of Horror. It's a one-bit style, kind of like a choose your own
Ooh,
adventure meets Junji Ito aesthetic.
yeah, yeah.
And
I mean, Junji Ito is worth studying in the context of all this in general.
mhm. And like he's also really good at that build up. I mean, you can do build up in just about any medium. Like he does it in his books.
It's probably worthwhile, right? That like I can just be flipping
Mhm.
backwards through a book and a manga, and then suddenly it's like, oh, I don't feel so good anymore.
Yeah, like show someone who's never experienced horror, Spirals or Uzumaki.
Yeah,
Let's see how they enjoy that one. Like the problem for me though is I've read after experiencing horror, so like for me it had like no impact. It's like, oh, he's all curled up. Oh, her face is missing, or it's just like, like I've gotten too exposed to horror.
and still though that spiral and the pattern of repetition, right,
Hmm.
and building that meaning, it's sort of like sort of conditioning and manipulating your brain is still an essential piece of it, and you can see
Hmm.
that in his work.
Oh yes, but
Yeah, stuff.
I think there's 2 points that I want to kind of end on, and I think I'll throw over to you. So the first one, like kind of like wrapping when it comes to multiplayer horror, and going back to what Draco was talking about with Among Us, that if you're doing multiplayer horror, I think again it really hinges on who you're playing with. Like I'm horrible when it comes to being the traitor or the imposter in Among Us. So for me, it doesn't really do much. But like there are games like Dead by Daylight that if you're playing against somebody who really knows how to be that killer, you know, you are in deep trouble. And again, it has to do. Well, oh, you good? Okay,
Okay.
okay, and it really has to come down to who is kind of steering the ship when it comes to horror. Just like if you're developing it like a single player horror game, you need to understand, you need to be really great at it in order to get terror out of it.
Yeah.
And
An interesting example there is: have you ever played the Splinter Cell multiplayer game where some people could be the guards and the other people could be the infiltrators?
a long time ago, yes.
So if you're really good at insertion, it becomes very scary for the guards. And if you're bad, then it's kind of more like a mall cop situation with like a teenager trying to steal something
Yeah.
from the store.
Hmm. It kind of reminds me a little bit of like when they did the stealth gameplay for Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, where you can play as Noir Spider-Man, and this whole idea that the guards just run, mind their own business, and then thwack, and they get like pulled into the dark and then taken care of, and like it would
Yeah.
be. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, it's like for the guard, it's scary.
Yeah, like I could see like potential of something like a Batman or Spider-Man, asymmetrical horror. One person playing as them and the other people just playing as the nameless thugs, and trying to survive when Batman is waiting to swoop down on you at any moment.
Yeah, and the Alien versus Predator with
Mm-hmm.
Space Marines, aliens, and predators, you got a little bit of that too. There was
Mm-hmm.
some real great moments there.
Oh yes. So my final point, and then I'll throw it to you. I think, like, even though I've been joking around and saying that, horror doesn't bother me, or, I've gotten really tired of it, or I know all the tricks, I can still, I think, recognize really good horror. Like, when you really get that set up right. I remember watching a streamer, I think Balkan Soup, I hope I didn't butcher his name too much, who does a lot of horror games, a lot of horror speedruns. And he talked about in one of his streams that even though I'm not jumping at these games or, I'm not, freaking out like other YouTubers and streamers, I understand when there's really good horror. Like, I know when the developer did their job right. Even if it didn't scare me, I know, when it's really good. When we played a Cry of Fear on stream. Or when we do play like some like the classics like Silent Hill, the first Resident Evils, that yes, to somebody who has experienced horror day in and day out, those games aren't terrifying to them. But you can still, and I think this is again very important for developers to understand, you still have to study and know, even if it doesn't scare you, what scares somebody. And again, it's that fear of the unknown. It's about that proper setup. And when you do it right, you can make anything terrifying. You could do, horror at the DMV or more horror at the DMV.
Or Cable Guy.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree. And honestly, if things don't scare you, you can't make good horror because you don't know what it's about.
Yeah.
You need to get your actual soul right there and go like, oh, I feel it. And then disassemble what made you feel that way and do that like hundreds and hundreds of times till you're like, I think I understand. I have a taxonomy of rules for how to induce a fear response out of someone.
Yeah.
And until you're there, it's like, don't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars trying to make a game that can do that to others.
Yeah. I've had enough traumatic nightmares. I know what terrifies me that I can easily put into a video game. But I'm going to throw it to you, Tomo. Do you have any final thoughts on horror to end our discussion with?
Well, I think my final thought really is that this conversation, we could have this conversation again for all manner of eliciting responses, emotional responses from
Mm-hmm.
users, and that there are a whole range of games out there that are more or less good at it. And some of the best games that we imagine are sometimes really terrible at this particular thing. And there are many games out there whose mechanics are sometimes quite terrible, who show some strong mastery of this kind of emotional manipulation. And it's definitely a worthy space to kind of analyze and understand.
Definitely. And we'll have to come with some more topics for our next discussion. If anyone has suggestions, let us know in the comments. But we'll wrap things up here for our chat. So, as our little final, I guess, social pitches and whatnot. If you're new, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing here. You'll find links to Twitter, Discord, Patreon, link down below. And if you're interested in my book, Game Design Deep Dive Horror, it is now out where books are being sold. So, over to you, Tomo, for where people can find you and all the backlinks and whatnot.
Yeah, so my studio, Hyperkinetic Studios, has a game on Steam Early Access. It's been there for quite a long time, but we're hoping to get out of Early Access, and it's called Epic Tavern. And you can find us both on Twitch at twitch.tv/Epic Tavern, as well as Discord, where we love to discuss all manner of things, storytelling, video game industry, and game design, and Epic Tavern related, of course, at discord.gg/Epic Tavern. Glad to be here as always. It was a great conversation.
Yep, always great to have you, and hopefully we'll be sub to another roundtable in the future as well. So, everyone, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we some of the art and science of games. And until next time, take care.
Bye, guys.